against the feeling of having triumphed over them by one's own strength, and the consequent exaltation that bears down everything before it, no earthly powers can resist. And when Ulysses approached them, the potent songstresses actually did not sing, whether because they thought that this enemy could be vanquished only by their silence, or because the look of bliss on the face of Ulysses, who was thinking of nothing but his wax and his chains, made them forget their singing. But Ulysses, if one may so express it, did not hear their silence. He thought they were singing and that he alone did not hear them. For a fleeting moment he saw their throats rising and falling, their breasts lifting, their eyes filled with tears, their lips half parted, but believed that these were accompaniments to the airs which died unheard around him. Soon, however, all this faded from his sight as he fixed his gaze on the distance. The sirens literally vanished before his resolution, and at the very moment when they were nearest to him he knew of them no longer. But they, lovelier than ever, stretched their necks and turned, let their awesome hair flutter free in the wind, and freely stretched their claws on the rocks. They no longer had any desire to allure. All that they wanted was to hold as long as they could the radiance that fell from Ulysses' great eyes. If the sirens had possessed consciousness, they would have been annihilated at that moment. But they remained as they had been. All that had happened was that Ulysses had escaped them. A codicil to the foregoing has also been handed down. Ulysses, it is said, was so full of guile, was such a fox, that not even the goddess of fate could pierce his armor. Perhaps he had really noticed, although here the human understanding is beyond its depths, that the sirens were silent, and held up to them and to the gods the aforementioned pretense merely as a sort of shield. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Prometheus. There are 4 legends concerning Prometheus. According to the first, he was clamped to a rock in the Caucasus for betraying the secrets of the gods to men, and the gods sent eagles to feed on his liver, which was perpetually renewed. According to the second, Prometheus, goaded by the pain of the tearing beaks, pressed himself deeper and deeper into the rock until he became one with it. According to the third, his treachery was forgotten in the course of thousands of years, forgotten by the gods, the eagles, forgotten by himself. According to the fourth, everyone grew weary of the meaningless affair. The gods grew weary, the eagles grew weary, the wound closed wearily. There remained the inexplicable mass of rock. The legend tried to explain the inexplicable. As it came out of a substratum of truth, it had in turn to end in the inexplicable. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The City Coat of Arms. At first all the arrangements for building the Tower of Babel were characterized by fairly good order. Indeed, the order was perhaps too perfect. Too much thought was given to guides, interpreters, accommodations for the workmen, and roads of communication, as if there were centuries before one to do the work in. In fact, the general opinion at that time was that one simply could not build too slowly. A very little insistence on this would have sufficed to make one hesitate to lay the foundations at all. People argued in this way. The essential thing in the whole business is the idea of building a tower that will reach to heaven. In comparison with that idea, everything else is secondary. The idea, once seized in its magnitude, can never vanish again. So long as there are men on the earth, there will be also the irresistible desire to complete the building. That being so, however, one need have no anxiety about the future. On the contrary, human knowledge is increasing. The art of building has made progress and will make further progress. A piece of work which takes us a year may perhaps be done in half the time in another 100 years, and better done, too, more enduringly. So why exert oneself to the extreme limit of one's present powers? There would be some sense in doing that only if it were likely that the tower could be completed in 1 generation. But that is beyond all hope. It is far more likely that the next generation with their perfected knowledge will find the work of their predecessors bad, and tear down what has been built so as to begin anew. Such thoughts paralyzed people's powers, and so they troubled less about the tower than the construction of a city for the workmen. Every nationality wanted the finest quarter for itself, and this gave rise to disputes, which developed into bloody conflicts. These conflicts never came to an end. To the leaders they were a new proof that, in the absence of the necessary unity, the building of the tower must be done very slowly, or indeed preferably postponed until universal peace was declared. But the time was spent not only in conflict, the town was embellished in the intervals, and this unfortunately enough evoked fresh envy and fresh conflict. In this fashion the age of the first generation went past, but none of the succeeding ones showed any difference, except that technical skill increased and with it occasion for conflict. To this must be added that the second or third generation had already recognized the senselessness of building a heaven-reaching tower, but by that time everybody was too deeply involved to leave the city. All the legends and songs that came to birth in that city are filled with longing for a prophesied day when the city would be destroyed by 5 successive blows from a gigantic fist. It is for that reason too that the city has a closed fist on its coat of arms. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Poseidon. Poseidon sat at his desk, going over the accounts. The administration of all the waters gave him endless work. He could have had as many assistants as he wanted, and indeed he had quite a number, but since he took his job very seriously he insisted on going through all the accounts again himself, and so his assistants were of little help to him. It cannot be said that he enjoyed the work. He carried it out simply because it was assigned to him. Indeed, he had frequently applied for what he called more cheerful work, but whenever various suggestions were put to him it turned out that nothing suited him so well as his present employment. Needless to say, it was very difficult to find him another job. After all, he could not possibly be put in charge of one particular ocean. Quite apart from the fact that in this case the work involved would not be less, only more petty, the great Poseidon could hold only a superior position. And when he was offered a post unrelated to the waters, the very idea made him feel sick, his divine breath came short and his brazen chest began to heave. As a matter of fact, no one took his troubles very seriously. When a mighty man complains, one must pretend to yield, however hopeless the case may seem. No one ever really considered relieving Poseidon of his position. He had been destined to be god of the seas since time immemorial, and that was how it had to remain. What annoyed him most, and this was the chief cause of discontent with his job, was to learn of the rumors that were circulating about him. For instance, that he was constantly cruising through the waves with his trident. Instead of which here he was sitting in the depths of the world's ocean endlessly going over the accounts, an occasional journey to Jupiter being the only interruption of the monotony, a journey moreover from which he invariably returned in a furious temper. As a result, he had hardly seen the oceans, save fleetingly during his hasty ascent to Olympus, and had never really sailed upon them. He used to say that he was postponing this until the end of the world, for then there might come a quiet moment when, just before the end and having gone through the last account, he could still make a quick little tour. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. Fellowship. We are 5 friends. One day we came out of a house one after the other. First one came and placed himself beside the gate. Then the second came, or rather he glided through the gate like a little ball of quicksilver, and placed himself near the first one. Then came the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Finally we all stood in a row. People began to notice us. They pointed at us and said, "Those 5 just came out of that house." Since then we have been living together. It would be a peaceful life if it weren't for a 6th one continually trying to interfere. He doesn't do us any harm, but he annoys us, and that is harm enough. Why does he intrude where he is not wanted? We don't know him and don't want him to join us. There was a time, of course, when the 5 of us did not know one another, either, and it could be said that we still don't know one another, but what is possible and can be tolerated by the 5 of us is not possible and cannot be tolerated with this 6th one. In any case, we are 5 and don't want to be 6. And what is the point of this continual being together anyhow? It is also pointless for the 5 of us, but here we are together and will remain together. A new combination, however, we do not want, just because of our experiences. But how is one to make all this clear to the 6th one? Long explanations would almost amount to accepting him in our circle, so we prefer not to explain and not to accept him. No matter how he pouts his lips, we push him away with our elbows, but however much we push him away, back he comes. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. At night. Deeply lost in the night. Just as one sometimes lowers one's head to reflect, thus to be utterly lost in the night. All around people are asleep. It's just play acting, an innocent self-deception, that they sleep in houses, in safe beds, under a safe roof, stretched out or curled up on mattresses, in sheets, under blankets. In reality they have flocked together as they had once upon a time and again later in a deserted region, a camp in the open, a countless number of men, an army, a people, under a cold sky on cold earth, collapsed where once they had stood, forehead pressed on the arm, face to the ground, breathing quietly. And you are watching, are one of the watchmen. You find the next one by brandishing a burning stick from the brushwood pile beside you. Why are you watching? Someone must watch, it is said. Someone must be there. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The problem of our laws. Our laws are not generally known. They are kept secret by the small group of nobles who rule us. We are convinced that these ancient laws are scrupulously administered. Nevertheless, it is an extremely painful thing to be ruled by laws that one does not know. I am not thinking of possible discrepancies that may arise in the interpretation of the laws, or of the disadvantages involved when only a few and not the whole people are allowed to have a say in their interpretation. These disadvantages are perhaps of no great importance. For the laws are very ancient, their interpretation has been the work of centuries, and has itself doubtless acquired the status of law. And though there is still a possible freedom of interpretation left, it has now become very restricted. Moreover, the nobles have obviously no cause to be influenced in their interpretation by personal interests inimical to us, for the laws were made to the advantage of the nobles from the very beginning. They themselves stand above the laws, and that seems to be why the laws were entrusted exclusively into their hands. Of course, there is wisdom in that. Who doubts the wisdom of the ancient laws? But also hardship for us. Probably that is unavoidable. The very existence of these laws, however, is at most a matter of presumption. There is a tradition that they exist and that they are a mystery confided to the nobility, but it is not and cannot be more than a mere tradition sanctioned by age, for the essence of a secret code is that it should remain a mystery. Some of us among the people have attentively scrutinized the doings of the nobility since the earliest times and possess records made by our forefathers. Records which we have conscientiously continued, and claim to recognize amid the countless number of facts certain main tendencies which permit of this or that historical formulation. But when in accordance with these scrupulously tested and logically ordered conclusions we seek to adjust ourselves somewhat for the present or the future, everything becomes uncertain, and our work seems only an intellectual game, for perhaps these laws that we are trying to unravel do not exist at all. There is a small party who are actually of this opinion and who try to show that, if any law exists, it can only be this. The law is whatever the nobles do. This party see everywhere only the arbitrary acts of the nobility, and reject the popular tradition, which according to them possesses only certain trifling and incidental advantages that do not offset its heavy drawbacks, for it gives the people a false, deceptive, and overconfident security in confronting coming events. This cannot be gainsaid, but the overwhelming majority of our people account for it by the fact that the tradition is far from complete and must be more fully inquired into, that the material available, prodigious as it looks, is still too meager, and that several centuries will have to pass before it becomes really adequate. This view, so comfortless as far as the present is concerned, is lightened only by the belief that a time will eventually come when the tradition and our research into it will jointly reach their conclusion, and as it were gain a breathing space, when everything will have become clear, the law will belong to the people, and the nobility will vanish. This is not maintained in any spirit of hatred against the nobility, not at all, and by no one. We are more inclined to hate ourselves because we have not yet shown ourselves worthy of being entrusted with the laws. And that is the real reason why the party who believe that there is no law have remained so few, although their doctrine is in certain ways so attractive, for it unequivocally recognizes the nobility and its right to go on existing. Actually, one can express the problem only in a sort of paradox. Any party that would repudiate not only all belief in the laws, but the nobility as well, would have the whole people behind it, yet no such party can come into existence, for nobody would dare to repudiate the nobility. We live on this razor's edge. A writer once summed the matter up in this way: the sole visible and indubitable law that is imposed upon us is the nobility, and must we ourselves deprive ourselves of that one law? Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The conscription of troops. The conscription of troops, often necessary on account of the never-ending frontier wars, takes place in the following manner. The order goes out that on a certain day in a certain part of town all inhabitants, men, women, and children without exception, have to remain indoors. Usually at about noon the young nobleman in charge of the conscription appears at the entrance of that part of town where a detachment of soldiers, both infantry and cavalry, has been waiting since dawn. He is a young man, slender, not tall, weak, carelessly dressed, with tired eyes, waves of restlessness continually passing through him like the shivers of a fever. Without looking at anyone he makes a sign with a whip, his sole equipment, whereupon several soldiers join him and he enters the first house. A soldier, who knows personally all the inhabitants in this part of town, reads out the list of the inmates. As a rule they are all present, lined up in the room, their eyes fixed on the nobleman, as though they were soldiers already. It can happen, however, that here and there someone, it's invariably a man, is missing. In this case no one will dare to utter an excuse, let alone a lie. Everyone is silent, all eyes are lowered, the pressure of the command which someone in this house has evaded is almost unbearable, but the silent presence of the nobleman keeps everyone nevertheless in his place. The nobleman makes a sign, it's not even a nod, it can be read only in his eyes, and two soldiers begin the search for the missing man. This is not difficult. He is never out of the house, never really intends to evade military service, it's only fear that has prevented him from turning up, yet it's not fear of the service itself that keeps him away, it's the general reluctance to show himself, for him the command is almost too great, so frighteningly great that he cannot appear of his own accord. This is why he does not flee, he simply goes into hiding, and on learning that the nobleman is in the house he even leaves his hiding place and creeps to the door of the room where he is promptly caught by the soldiers in search of him. He is brought before the nobleman who seizes the whip with both hands. He is so weak he can't do it with one hand, and gives the man a thrashing. Having inflicted no great pain, he drops the whip, half from exhaustion, half from disgust, whereupon the beaten man has to pick it up and hand it to him. Only then may he join the line with the others. Incidentally, it is almost certain that he will not be recruited. But it also happens, and this is more frequent, that a greater number of people appear than are listed. There, for instance, stands an unknown girl, staring at the nobleman. She is from out of town, from the provinces perhaps, the conscription has lured her here. There are many women who cannot resist the temptation of a conscription in another town, conscriptions at home meaning something quite different. And, strangely enough, it is not considered disgraceful for a woman to surrender to this temptation. On the contrary, in the opinion of many, this is something women have to go through, a debt which they pay to their sex. Moreover, it invariably takes the same course. The girl or the woman learns that somewhere, perhaps very far away, at the home of relatives or friends, a conscription is going to take place. She asks her family for permission to undertake the journey, which is granted. It cannot very well be refused. She puts on her best clothes, is gayer than usual, at the same time calm and friendly, no matter what she may be like at other times. And yet behind all the calm and friendliness she is inaccessible, like an utter stranger who is on her way home and can think of nothing else. In the family where the conscription is going to take place she is received quite differently from an ordinary guest. Everyone flatters her, she is invited to walk through all the rooms in the house, lean out of all the windows, and if she puts her hand on someone's head it means more than a father's blessing. When the family is preparing for the conscription she is given the best place, which is near the door where she has the best chance of being seen by the nobleman and can best see him. She is honored in this way, however, only until the nobleman enters. Thereafter she begins to fade. He looks at her as little as at the others, and even when his eye rests on someone, that person is not aware of being looked at. This is something she has not expected, or rather she certainly has, for it cannot be otherwise, yet it wasn't the expectation of the opposite that had driven her here, it was just something that had now definitely come to an end. She feels shame to a degree which our women possibly feel at no other time. Only now is she fully aware of having forced her way into a foreign conscription, and when the soldier has read out the list and her name is not on it and there comes a moment of silence, she flees stooped and trembling out of the door, receiving in addition a blow in the back from a soldier's fist. Should the person not on the list be a man, his only desire is to be conscripted with the others, although he does not belong to this house. But this too is utterly out of the question. An outsider of this kind has never been conscripted and nothing of the sort will ever happen. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The test. I am a servant, but there is no work for me. I am timid and don't push myself to the fore, indeed I don't even push myself into line with the others, but that is only one reason for my non-employment. It's even possible that it has nothing to do with my non-employment. In any case, the main thing is that I am not called upon to serve. Others have been called, yet they have not tried harder than I, indeed perhaps they have not even felt the desire to be called, whereas I, at least sometimes, have felt it very strongly. So I lie on the pallet in the servants' hall, stare at the beams in the ceiling, fall asleep, wake up, and promptly fall asleep again. Occasionally I walk over to the tavern where they sell a sour beer. Occasionally I have even poured away a glass in disgust, but at other times I drink it. I like sitting there because from behind the closed little window, without the possibility of being discovered, I can see across to the windows of our house. Not that one sees very much there, to my knowledge only the windows of the corridors look out on the street, and moreover not even those of the corridors leading to my employer's apartments. But it is also possible that I am mistaken. Someone, without my having asked him, once said so, and the general impression of this house front confirms this. Only rarely are the windows opened, and when this does occur it is done by a servant who may lean against the balustrade to look down for a while. It follows therefore that these are corridors where he cannot be taken by surprise. As a matter of fact, I am not personally acquainted with these servants. Those who are permanently employed upstairs sleep elsewhere, not in my room. Once when I arrived at the tavern, a guest was sitting at my observation post. I did not dare look at him closely and was about to turn around in the door and leave. The guest, however, called me over, and it turned out that he too was a servant whom I had once seen somewhere before, but without having spoken to him. Why do you want to run away? Sit down and have a drink. I'll pay. So I sat down. He asked me several things, but I couldn't answer, indeed I didn't even understand his questions. So I said, perhaps you are sorry now that you invited me, so I'd better go, and I was about to get up. But he stretched his hand out over the table and pressed me down. Stay, he said, that was only a test. He who does not answer the questions has passed the test. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The vulture. A vulture was hacking at my feet. It had already torn my boots and stockings to shreds, now it was hacking at the feet themselves. Again and again it struck at them, then circled several times restlessly around me, then returned to continue its work. A gentleman passed by, looked on for a while, then asked me why I suffered the vulture. I'm helpless, I said. When it came and began to attack me, I of course tried to drive it away, even to strangle it. But these animals are very strong. It was about to spring at my face, but I preferred to sacrifice my feet. Now they are almost torn to bits. Fancy letting yourself be tortured like this, said the gentleman. One shot and that's the end of the vulture. Really? I said. And would you do that? With pleasure, said the gentleman. I've only got to go home and get my gun. Could you wait another half hour? I'm not sure about that, said I, and stood for a moment rigid with pain. Then I said, do try it in any case, please. Very well, said the gentleman, I'll be as quick as I can. During this conversation the vulture had been calmly listening, letting its eye rove between me and the gentleman. Now I realized that it had understood everything. It took wing, leaned far back to gain impetus, and then, like a javelin thrower, thrust its beak through my mouth, deep into me. Falling back, I was relieved to feel him drowning irretrievably in my blood, which was filling every depth, flooding every shore. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The helmsman. Am I not the helmsman here? I called out. You? Asked a tall, dark man and passed his hands over his eyes as though to banish a dream. I had been standing at the helm in the dark night, a feeble lantern burning over my head, and now this man had come and tried to push me aside. And as I would not yield, he put his foot on my chest and slowly crushed me while I still clung to the hub of the helm, wrenching it around and falling. But the man seized it, pulled it back in place, and pushed me away. I soon collected myself, however, ran to the hatchway which gave on to the mess quarters, and cried out, Men! Comrades! Come here, quick! A stranger has driven me away from the helm. Slowly they came up, climbing the companion ladder, tired, swaying, powerful figures. Am I the helmsman? I asked. They nodded, but they had eyes only for the stranger, stood around him in a semicircle, and when, in a commanding voice, he said, Don't disturb me, they gathered together, nodded at me, and withdrew down the companion ladder. What kind of people are these? Do they ever think, or do they only shuffle pointlessly over the earth? Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The top. A certain philosopher used to hang about wherever children were at play. And whenever he saw a boy with a top, he would lie in wait. As soon as the top began to spin, the philosopher went in pursuit and tried to catch it. He was not perturbed when the children noisily protested and tried to keep him away from their toy. So long as he could catch the top while it was still spinning, he was happy, but only for a moment. Then he threw it to the ground and walked away. For he believed that the understanding of any detail, that of a spinning top, for instance, was sufficient for the understanding of all things. For this reason he did not busy himself with great problems. It seemed to him uneconomical. Once the smallest detail was understood, then everything was understood, which was why he busied himself only with the spinning top. And whenever preparations were being made for the spinning of the top, he hoped that this time it would succeed. As soon as the top began to spin and he was running breathlessly after it, the hope would turn to certainty, but when he held the silly piece of wood in his hand, he felt nauseated. The screaming of the children, which hitherto he had not heard and which now suddenly pierced his ears, chased him away, and he tottered like a top under a clumsy whip. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. A little fable. Alas, said the mouse, the world is growing smaller every day. At the beginning it was so big that I was afraid. I kept running, and I was glad when at last I saw walls far away to the right and left, but these long walls have narrowed so quickly that I am in the last chamber already, and there in the corner stands the trap that I must run into. You only need to change your direction, said the cat, and ate it up. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Homecoming. I have returned. I have passed under the arch and am looking around. It's my father's old yard. The puddle in the middle. Old, useless tools, jumbled together, block the way to the attic stairs. The cat lurks on the banister. A torn piece of cloth, once wound around a stick in a game, flutters in the breeze. I have arrived. Who is going to receive me? Who is waiting behind the kitchen door? Smoke is rising from the chimney, coffee is being made for supper. Do you feel you belong? Do you feel at home? I don't know, I feel most uncertain. My father's house it is, but each object stands cold beside the next, as though preoccupied with its own affairs, which I have partly forgotten, partly never known. What use can I be to them? What do I mean to them, even though I am the son of my father, the old farmer? And I don't dare knock at the kitchen door. I only listen from a distance, standing up, in such a way that I cannot be taken by surprise as an eavesdropper. And since I am listening from a distance, I hear nothing but a faint striking of the clock passing over from childhood days, but perhaps I only think I hear it. Whatever else is going on in the kitchen is the secret of those sitting there, a secret they're keeping from me. The longer one hesitates before the door, the more estranged one becomes. What would happen if someone were to open the door now and ask me a question? Would not I myself then behave like one who wants to keep his secret? Translated by Tanya and James Stern. First sorrow. A trapeze artist, this art, practiced high in the vaulted domes of the great variety theaters, is admittedly one of the most difficult humanity can achieve, had so arranged his life that, as long as he kept working in the same building, he never came down from his trapeze by night or day, at first only from a desire to perfect his skill, but later because custom was too strong for him. All his needs, very modest needs at that, were supplied by relays of attendants who watched from below and sent up and hauled down again in specially constructed containers whatever he required. This way of living caused no particular inconvenience to the theatrical people, except that, when other turns were on the stage, his being still up aloft, which could not be dissembled, proved somewhat distracting, as also the fact that, although at such times he mostly kept very still, he drew a stray glance here and there from the public. Yet the management overlooked this, because he was an extraordinary and unique artist. And of course they recognized that this mode of life was no mere prank, and that only in this way could he really keep himself in constant practice and his art at the pitch of its perfection. Besides, it was quite healthful up there, and when in the warmer seasons of the year the side windows all around the dome of the theater were thrown open and sun and fresh air came pouring irresistibly into the dusky vault, it was even beautiful. True, his social life was somewhat limited, only sometimes a fellow acrobat swarmed up the ladder to him, and then they both sat on the trapeze, leaning left and right against the supporting ropes, and chatted, or builders' workmen repairing the roof exchanged a few words with him through an open window, or the fireman, inspecting the emergency lighting in the top gallery, called over to him something that sounded respectful but could hardly be made out. Otherwise nothing disturbed his seclusion. Occasionally, perhaps, some theater hand straying through the empty theater of an afternoon gazed thoughtfully up into the great height of the roof, almost beyond eyeshot, where the trapeze artist, unaware that he was being observed, practiced his art or rested. The trapeze artist could have gone on living peacefully like that, had it not been for the inevitable journeys from place to place, which he found extremely trying. Of course his manager saw to it that his sufferings were not prolonged one moment more than necessary. For town travel, racing automobiles were used, which whirled him, by night if possible or in the earliest hours of the morning, through the empty streets at breakneck speed, too slow all the same for the trapeze artist's impatience. For railway journeys, a whole compartment was reserved, in which the trapeze artist, as a possible though wretched alternative to his usual way of living, could pass the time up on the luggage rack, in the next town on their circuit, long before he arrived. The trapeze was already slung up in the theater and all the doors leading to the stage were flung wide open, all corridors kept free. Yet the manager never knew a happy moment until the trapeze artist set his foot on the rope ladder and in a twinkling, at long last, hung aloft on his trapeze. Despite so many journeys having been successfully arranged by the manager, each new one embarrassed him again, for the journeys, apart from everything else, got on the nerves of the artist a great deal. Once when they were again traveling together, the trapeze artist lying on the luggage rack dreaming, the manager leaning back in the opposite window seat reading a book, the trapeze artist addressed his companion in a low voice. The manager was immediately all attention. The trapeze artist, biting his lips, said that he must always in future have 2 trapezes for his performance instead of only 1, 2 trapezes opposite each other. The manager at once agreed. But the trapeze artist, as if to show that the manager's consent counted for as little as his refusal, said that never again would he perform on only 1 trapeze, in no circumstances whatever. The very idea that it might happen at all seemed to make him shudder. The manager, watchfully feeling his way, once more emphasized his entire agreement. 2 trapezes were better than 1. Besides, it would be an advantage to have a second bar. More variety could be introduced into the performance. At that the trapeze artist suddenly burst into tears. Deeply distressed, the manager sprang to his feet and asked what was the matter, then getting no answer climbed up on the seat and caressed him, cheek to cheek, so that his own face was bedabbled by the trapeze artist's tears. Yet it took much questioning and soothing endearment until the trapeze artist sobbed. Only the 1 bar in my hands. How can I go on living? That made it somewhat easier for the manager to comfort him. He promised to wire from the very next station for a second trapeze to be installed in the first town on their circuit, reproached himself for having let the artist work so long on only 1 trapeze, and thanked and praised him warmly for having at last brought the mistake to his notice. And so he succeeded in reassuring the trapeze artist, little by little, and was able to go back to his corner. But he himself was far from reassured. With deep uneasiness he kept glancing secretly at the trapeze artist over the top of his book. Once such ideas began to torment him, would they ever quite leave him alone? Would they not rather increase in urgency? Would they not threaten his very existence? And indeed the manager believed he could see, during the apparently peaceful sleep which had succeeded the fit of tears, the first furrows of care engraving themselves upon the trapeze artist's smooth, childlike forehead. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The departure. I ordered my horse to be brought from the stables. The servant did not understand my orders. So I went to the stables myself, saddled my horse, and mounted. In the distance I heard the sound of a trumpet, and I asked the servant what it meant. He knew nothing and had heard nothing. At the gate he stopped me and asked, "Where is the master going?" "I don't know," I said, "just out of here, just out of here." "Out of here, nothing else, it's the only way I can reach my goal." "So you know your goal?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, "I've just told you. Out of here, that's my goal." Translated by Tanya and James Stern. Advocates. I was not at all certain whether I had any advocates. I could not find out anything definite about it. Every face was unfriendly. Most people who came toward me and whom I kept meeting in the corridors looked like fat old women. They had huge blue and white striped aprons covering their entire bodies, kept stroking their stomachs and swaying awkwardly to and fro. I could not even find out whether we were in a law court. Some facts spoke for it, others against. What reminded me of a law court more than all the details was a droning noise which could be heard incessantly in the distance. One could not tell from which direction it came. It filled every room to such an extent that one had to assume it came from everywhere, or, what seemed more likely, that just the place where one happened to be standing was the very place where the droning originated, but this was probably an illusion, for it came from a distance. These corridors, narrow and austerely vaulted, turning in gradual curves with high, sparsely decorated doors, seemed to have been created specially for profound silence. They were the corridors of a museum or a library. Yet if it were not a law court, why was I searching for an advocate here? Because I was searching for an advocate everywhere. He is needed everywhere, if anything less in court than elsewhere, for a court, one assumes, passes judgment according to the law. If one were to assume that this was being done unfairly or frivolously, then life would not be possible. One must have confidence that the court allows the majesty of the law its full scope, for this is its sole duty. Within the law all is accusation, advocacy, and verdict. Any interference by an individual here would be a crime. It is different, however, in the case of the verdict itself. This is based on inquiries being made here and there, from relatives and strangers, from friends and enemies, in the family and public life, in town and village, in short, everywhere. Here it is most necessary to have advocates, advocates galore, the best possible advocates, one next to the other, a living wall, for advocates are by nature hard to set in motion. The plaintiffs, however, those sly foxes, those slinking weasels, those little mice, they slip through the tiniest gaps, scuttle through the legs of the advocates. So look out. That's why I am here, I'm collecting advocates. But I have not found any as yet, only those old women keep on coming and going. If I were not on my search it would put me to sleep. I'm not in the right place, alas, I cannot rid myself of the feeling that I'm not in the right place. I ought to be in a place where all kinds of people meet, from various parts of the country, from every class, every profession, of all ages. I ought to have an opportunity of choosing carefully out of a crowd those who are kind, those who are able, and those who have an eye for me. Perhaps the most suitable place for this would be a huge fairground, instead of which I am hanging about in these corridors where only these old women are to be seen, and not even many of them, and always the same ones, and even those few will not let themselves be cornered, despite their slowness. They slip away from me, float about like rain clouds, and are completely absorbed by unknown activities. Why is it then that I run headlong into a house without reading the sign over the door, promptly find myself in these corridors, and settle here with such obstinacy that I cannot even remember ever having been in front of the house, ever having run up the stairs? But back I cannot go. This waste of time, this admission of having been on the wrong track would be unbearable for me. What? Run downstairs in this brief, hurried life accompanied as it is by that impatient droning? Impossible. The time allotted to you is so short that if you lose 1 second you have already lost your whole life, for it is no longer, it is always just as long as the time you lose. So if you have started out on a walk, continue it whatever happens, you can only gain, you run no risk. In the end you may fall over a precipice perhaps, but had you turned back after the first steps and run downstairs you would have fallen at once, and not perhaps, but for certain. So if you find nothing in the corridors, open the doors. If you find nothing behind these doors, there are more floors, and if you find nothing up there, don't worry, just leap up another flight of stairs. As long as you don't stop climbing, the stairs won't end, under your climbing feet they will go on growing upwards. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. The Married Couple. Business in general is so bad that sometimes, when my work in the office leaves me a little time, I myself pick up the case of samples and call on my customers personally. Long since I had intended to visit sometime, among others, N, with whom once I had constant business relations, which, however, during the last year have almost completely lapsed for some reason unknown to me. Besides, there need not always be real reasons for such disruptions. In the present unstable state of affairs often a mere nothing, a mood, will turn the scale, and in the same way a mere nothing, a word, can put things right again. To gain admittance to N, however, is a somewhat ticklish business. He is an old man, grown somewhat infirm too of late, and though he still insists on attending to business matters himself, he is hardly ever to be seen in his office. If you want to speak to him you have to go to his house, and one likes to put off a business call of that kind. Last evening after 6 I nevertheless set out for his house. It was really no time for paying calls, but my visit after all was a business, not a social, one, and might be regarded accordingly. I was in luck. N was in. He had just come back with his wife from a walk, the servant told me, and was now in the bedroom of his son, who was unwell and confined to his bed. I was requested to go there. At first I hesitated, but then the desire to get my disagreeable visit over as quickly as possible turned the scale, and I allowed myself to be conducted as I was, in my overcoat and hat, with my case of samples, through a dark room into a faintly lit one, where a small company was gathered. My first glance fell, probably by instinct, on an agent only too well known to me, a trade rival of myself in some respects. So he had stolen a march on me, it seemed. He was sitting comfortably by the bed of the sick man, just as if he were a doctor. He sat there brazenly in his beautiful ample overcoat, which was unbuttoned. The sick man too probably had his own thoughts as he lay there with his cheeks faintly flushed with fever, now and then glancing at his visitor. He was no longer young either, N's son, a man of about my own age with a short beard, somewhat unkempt on account of his illness. Old N, a tall, broad-shouldered man, but to my astonishment grown very thin because of some creeping malady, bent and infirm, was still wearing the fur coat in which he had entered, and mumbling something to his son. His wife, small and frail, but immensely vivacious, yet only when she spoke to him, as others she scarcely noticed, was occupied in helping him to take off his overcoat, which, considering the great difference in their height, was a matter of some difficulty, but at last was achieved. Perhaps, indeed, the real difficulty was caused by N's impatience, for with restless hands he kept on feeling for the easy chair, which his wife, after the overcoat was off, quickly pushed forward for him. She herself then took up the fur coat, beneath which she almost vanished, and carried it out. Now at last, it seemed to me, my moment had come, or rather it had not come and probably would never come. Yet if I was to attempt anything it must be done at once, for I felt that here the conditions for a business interview could only become increasingly unfavorable, and to plant myself down here for all time, as the agent apparently intended, was not my way. Besides, I did not want to take the slightest notice of him. So I began without ceremony to state my business, although I saw that N would have liked at that moment to have a chat with his son. Unfortunately I have a habit when I have worked myself up, and that takes a very short time, and on this occasion took a shorter time than usual, of getting up and walking about while I am talking. Though a very good arrangement in one's own office, in a strange house it may be somewhat burdensome. But I could not restrain myself, particularly as I was feeling the lack of my usual cigarette. Well, every man has his bad habits, yet I can congratulate myself on mine when I think of the agent's. For what is to be said of his behavior, of the fact, for instance, that every now and then he would suddenly and quite unexpectedly clap his hat on his head. He had been holding it on his knee until then, slowly pushing it up and down there. True, he took it off again immediately, as if he had made a blunder, but he had had it on his head nevertheless for a second or two, and besides he repeated this performance again and again every few minutes. Surely such conduct must be called unpardonable. It did not disturb me, however. I walked up and down, completely absorbed in my own proposals, and ignored him. but there are people whom that trick with the hat might have put off completely. However, when I am thoroughly worked up I disregard not only such annoyances as these, but everything. I see, it is true, all that is going on, but do not admit it, so to speak, to my consciousness until I am finished, or until some objection is raised. Thus I noticed quite well, for instance, that N was by no means in a receptive state. Holding on to the arms of his chair, he twisted about uncomfortably, never even glanced up at me, but gazed blankly, as if searching for something, into vacancy, and his face was so impassive that one might have thought no syllable of what I was saying, indeed no awareness of my presence, had penetrated to him. Yes, his whole bearing, the bearing of a sick man, in itself inauspicious for me, I took in quite well. Nevertheless I talked on as if I had still some prospect of putting everything right again by my talk, by the advantageous offers I made. I was myself alarmed by the concessions I granted, concessions that had not even been asked for. It gave me a certain satisfaction also to notice that the agent, as I verified by a fleeting glance, had at last left his hat in peace and folded his arms across his chest. My performance, which was partly, I must confess, intended for him, seemed to have given a severe blow to his designs. And in the elation produced by this result I might perhaps have gone on talking for a long time still, if the son, whom until now I had regarded as a secondary factor in my plans, had not suddenly raised himself in his bed and pulled me up by shaking his fist. Obviously he wanted to say something, to point out something, but he had not strength enough. At first I thought that his mind was wandering, but when I involuntarily glanced at old N I understood better. N sat with wide open, glassy, bulging eyes, which seemed on the point of failing. He was trembling and his body was bent forward as if someone were holding him down or striking him on the shoulders. His lower lip, indeed the lower jaw itself with the exposed gums, hung down helplessly. His whole face seemed out of joint. He still breathed, though with difficulty, but then, as if released, he fell back against the back of his chair, closed his eyes, the mark of some great strain passed over his face and vanished, and all was over. I sprang to him and seized his lifeless hand, which was so cold that it sent a chill through me. No pulse beat there now. So it was all over. Still, he was a very old man. We would be fortunate if we all had such an easy death. But how much there was to be done. And what should one do first? I looked around for help, but the son had drawn the bedclothes over his head, and I could hear his wild sobbing. The agent, cold as a fish, sat immovably on his chair, 2 steps from N, and was obviously resolved to do nothing, to wait for what time would bring. So I was left to do something, and the hardest thing that anyone could be asked to do. That was to tell the news to his wife in some bearable form, in a form that did not exist, in other words. And already I could hear her eager shuffling steps in the next room. Still wearing her outdoor clothes, she had not found time to change. She brought in a nightshirt that she had warmed before the fire for her husband to put on. "He's fallen asleep," she said, smiling and shaking her head, when she found us sitting so still. And with the infinite trustfulness of the innocent she took up the same hand that I had held a moment before with such fear and repugnance, kissed it playfully, and, how could we 3 others have borne the sight? And moved, yawned loudly, allowed his nightshirt to be put on, endured with a mixture of annoyance and irony his wife's tender reproaches for having overstrained himself by taking such a long walk, and strangely enough said in reply, to provide no doubt a different explanation for his having fallen asleep, something about feeling bored. Then, so as not to catch cold by going through the draughty passage into a different room, he lay down for the time being in his son's bed. His head was bedded down beside his son's feet on 2 cushions hastily brought by his wife. After all that had gone before I found nothing particularly odd in that. Then he asked for the evening paper, opened it without paying any attention to his guests, but did not read it, only glancing through it here and there, and made several very unpleasant observations on our offers, observations which showed astonishing shrewdness, while he waved his free hand disdainfully, and by clicking his tongue indicated that our business methods had left a bad taste in his mouth. The agent could not refrain from making 1 or 2 untimely remarks. No doubt he felt in his insensitive way that some compensation was due to him after what had happened, but his way of securing it was the worst he could have chosen. I said goodbye as soon as I could. I felt almost grateful to the agent. If he had not been there I would not have had the resolution to leave so soon. In the lobby I met Frau N again. At the sight of that pathetic figure I said impulsively that she reminded me a little of my mother. And as she remained silent I added, whatever people say, she could do wonders. Things that we destroyed she could make whole again. I lost her when I was still a child. I had spoken with deliberate slowness and distinctness, for I assumed the old lady was hard of hearing. But she must have been quite deaf, for she asked without transition, "And how does my husband look to you?" From a few parting words I noticed, moreover, that she confused me with the agent. I like to think that otherwise she would have been more forthcoming. Then I descended the stairs. The descent was more tiring than the ascent had been, and not even that had been easy. Oh, how many business calls come to nothing, and yet one must keep going. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Give it up. It was very early in the morning, the streets clean and deserted. I was on my way to the station. As I compared the tower clock with my watch I realized it was much later than I had thought and that I had to hurry. The shock of this discovery made me feel uncertain of the way. I wasn't very well acquainted with the town as yet. Fortunately, there was a policeman at hand. I ran to him and breathlessly asked him the way. He smiled and said, "You asking me the way?" "Yes," I said, "since I can't find it myself." Give it up," said he, and turned with a sudden jerk, like someone who wants to be alone with his laughter. Translated by Tanya and James Stern. On parables. Many complain that the words of the wise are always merely parables and of no use in daily life, which is the only life we have. When the sage says, "Go over," he does not mean that we should cross to some actual place, which we could do anyhow if the labor were worth it. He means some fabulous yonder, something unknown to us, something that he cannot designate more precisely either, and therefore cannot help us here in the very least. All these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible, and we know that already. But the cares we have to struggle with every day, that is a different matter. Concerning this a man once said, "Why such reluctance? If you only followed the parables you yourselves would become parables and with that rid of all your daily cares." Another said, "I bet that is also a parable." The first said, "You have won." The second said, "But unfortunately only in parable." The first said, "No, in reality, in parable you have lost." Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Postscript. Albert Camus once said that, "The whole of Kafka's art consists in compelling the reader to reread him." Since the interpretations of Kafka are many and the search for the meaning of his stories seemingly endless, the reader will return to the story itself in the hope of finding guidance from within. Thus a second reading will, hopefully, become a commentary on the first, and subsequent readings will, again hopefully, shed light on the preceding ones. It is the purpose of this volume to provide ready access to the entire corpus of Kafka's stories. They, rather than the novels, constitute the very core of his brief life's work. The longer stories which form the bulk of the volume are followed by a collection of shorter stories and sketches. All stories published by Kafka during his lifetime and the material from the literary estate that Max Brod selected for publication after Kafka's death are included. Within the two parts, the longer and the shorter stories, a chronological order has been attempted. The notes by Max Brod and, later, the efforts of Klaus Wagenbach, Malcolm Pasley, and Ludwig Dietz to establish a literary chronology have been consulted and have offered welcome aid. Some dates remain approximations only. Kafka chose the titles of the stories in the case of material published by himself. All other tales were given their titles by Max Brod, except for Description of a Struggle, The Village, Schoolmaster, The Bucket Rider, The Great Wall of China, A Crossbreed, and The Problem of Our Laws, which come from Kafka's hand. The Stoker, though published by Kafka as a separate story, is not included. It has its rightful place as the first chapter of the novel America. Two brief dialogues, Conversation with the Supplicant, and Conversation with the Drunk, also published by Kafka, have been omitted. They reappear in their proper context in Description of a Struggle. However, The Trees, Clothes, and Excursion into the Mountains, also from Description of a Struggle, were retained. And, because of their special significance, two pieces, parts of other works by Kafka, are reproduced here as Introductory Parables, Before the Law, which reappears in the novel The Trial, and An Imperial Message, whose place is in The Great Wall of China. The fragments of The Hunter Gracchus, The Great Wall of China, and A Report to an Academy, are placed after the stories that bear these titles. The Warden of the Tomb, Kafka's only piece in dramatic form, was given hospitality in this volume of stories. In 1934, a decade after Franz Kafka's death, Schocken Verlag, Berlin, acquired the world rights to his works in an agreement made with Kafka's mother and with Max Brod, whom the author had appointed his literary executor. Between 1935 and 1937, Schocken Verlag published the first German edition of Kafka's collected writings. In 1946, Schocken Books Inc., New York, reissued this German-language edition, and has since published English-language translations of most of the works, see bibliography. In 1950, Schocken granted a license to S. Fischer Verlag, Frankfurt am Main, for German publication of Kafka's oeuvre. Kafka's writings have been translated and published in many countries, East and West. British editions are published by Martin Seeker and Warburg Limited, London. A critical edition of Kafka's complete works is being planned. This edition will make use of the original manuscripts deposited in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, and of other collections. Nahum N. Glazer. June 1971. Bibliography. I. Kafka's stories and collections of stories published during his L.I. F.E.T.I.M.E. For details, see the notes to the individual stories. Betrichtung. Leipzig. Rowohlt Verlag, 1913. Das Urteil. Eine Geschichte. Leipzig. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1913. Der Heiser. Ein Fragment. Leipzig. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1913. Die Verwandlung. Leipzig. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1915. 2D ed., 1918. In der Strafkolonie. Leipzig. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1919. Ein Landarzt. Kleine Erzählungen. Munich and Leipzig. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1919. Ein Hungerkünstler. Wir Geschichten. Berlin. Verlag die Schmied, 1924. 2. Kafka's works published after his death. Der Prozess. Berlin. Verlag. Die Schmied, 1925. Das Schloss. Munich. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1926. America. Munich. Kurt Wolf Verlag, 1927. Beim Bau der chinesischen Mauer. Ungedruckte Erzählungen und Prosa aus dem Nachlass. HSG. Von Max Brod und Hans Joachim Schopes.